culture war, it doesn't crowd out distributive conflict because it itself has a strong distributive component. And with respect to the radical right, I think what these parties have realized is that they need economic policies in order to implement their cultural principles.
Welcome to the New Enlightenment podcast, a production of Adam Smith's Panmure House. I'm your host, Adam Dixon. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Philip Rathgeb. Philip is an assistant professor in social policy in the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Edinburgh. Philip's research focuses on comparative political economy and comparative politics, with a particular focus on welfare states, industrial relations, and party politics. His recent research has focused on the impact of radical right parties on social and economic policies. He recently published a book with Oxford University Press entitled How the Radical Right Has Changed Capitalism and Welfare in Europe and the USA. And we will be discussing that book, including the upcoming European Parliament elections today on the podcast. Welcome, Philip.
Thank you very much, Adam.
So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about your book, and we're going to talk about the upcoming European Parliament elections in the beginning of June. And that was one of the key reasons why I wanted to have you on. But I also wanted to have you on to discuss what is the state of democracy today, or the state of democracy in the advanced economies, or what we call the advanced welfare states of Europe and North America. Where have we come from and why? And is it as bad, that is, in terms of the health of democracy, as some think? Some people think we're in a crisis. And I'm curious what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. It's a pleasure to be here. So I guess my approach to this question is comparative in nature. I mean, you alluded to this already, that I'm a comparativist. And from a comparative standpoint, we can look at this both in terms of variation over time, as well as variation across space. And my starting point to assess the health of democracy is basically the neoliberal consensus, which is to say that in the 1990s and 2000s in particular, what we had was a consensus around a set of economic policies that were more or less uncontested. They had a kind of hegemonic status in public debate. And these policies included fiscal discipline, they included labor market flexibility, they included free capital flows, they included free trade, abstaining from industrial policies, and basically removing barriers on the operation of the economy. And I think that's important for democracy insofar as it essentially protected capitalism from democracy, in the sense that, Margaret Thatcher had this famous dictum, there is no alternative. There is no alternative to that neoliberal consensus. And what this did, and I think this is how we basically get to the book and the rise of the radical right, is that it basically depoliticized the economy. So political conflict migrated to areas where there is disagreement, where there is conflict. So I think that the economic policy background of the neoliberal consensus created opportunities for the radical right to politicize on issues on which they strive. And this is immigration, asylum, identity, the whole culture war, if you want. And the radical right is the actor today around which we have concerns around the viability of liberal democracy. Viktor Orban speaks of an illiberal democracy, meaning attacks against the liberal component of a democracy, including the constitutional court, free media, so tilting the balance of power within the political system towards the incumbent, and thereby we have free elections, but no longer fair elections. So in other words, if we want to reflect on the health of democracy or observe a crisis of democracy, I think we have to separate two crises of democracy we had in the past, say, 20 to 30 years. I mean, when I came of age in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, the crisis of democracy we spoke about was that neoliberalism no longer allowed for alternatives to a set of economic policies. And this was evidenced in the euro crisis in particular, the sovereign debt crisis. Let us recall the Troika, the ECB, the IMF, and the European Commission devising a set of policies for Southern Europe and Ireland in particular, which didn't provide for any room for maneuver, for any government discretion, where the crisis of democracy was considered, as Colin Crouch called it, a famous British political economist, the strange non-death of neoliberalism, right? Which doesn't allow for policy alternatives, and thereby the policy space of a democratic debate is narrow, it's shrinking. And I think this, paved the way for the rise of what we call today populism, because what populism is about is to speak on behalf of, quote unquote, the people. The people, right? So you give voice to the people who feel to have no longer a big say on policymaking. And the radical right crafted this very successfully, as we can see in election outcomes over the past 2 decades at least. And they unleash a new crisis of democracy, which is not around economic policy alternatives, but rather around the liberal institutions of a democracy that are said to dilute the will of the people and thereby basically undermining a fair party competition context. So I think these two crises of democracy are inextricably linked.
Okay. So can you say a bit more about what you mean by the radical right or the far right? And I think most listeners have a good sense of who you're talking about. So Viktor Orban, for example, you've mentioned. But in the regular media, far right is frequently thrown out to discuss any policy on the right, notwithstanding whether it comes from a notionally far right party. So could you say a bit more about who is the far right and what their kind of values are, so that we have a sense of where you're coming from from an analytical perspective?
Right. So the way I use it is derived from the party politics literature in particular, and Cas Mudde's definition of the terms, who is a Dutch political scientist working in the United States, and who has published very extensively on the radical right and far right in particular. And the far right is basically an umbrella term for radical right and extreme right. So first, the extreme right refers to parties that reject democracy. Mm-hmm. So an example would be Golden Dawn in Greece, which was basically abolished for that reason. Mm-hmm. Radical right is the more common type of far-right party because it refers to parties that accept democracy or even claim to reinvigorate democracy, but they go against the liberal constitutional component of it. Mm-hmm. Because they authoritarian strongmen claiming to speak on behalf of the people, and the judiciary and the media and so on, they dilute that will of the people, and that's why they go against that component of democracy. Mm-hmm. That's kind of a distinction between radical right on the one hand and extreme right on the other. When it comes to their ideological characteristics beyond the democracy question, we speak about parties that have a nativist ideology and an authoritarian ideology. So nativism refers to a xenophobic version of nationalism. Mm-hmm. So basically saying that the nation state should be inhabited and dominated by native people and native ideas, excluding foreigners and foreign ideas. Yeah, so there is this famous example from Austria, from Germany, in fact, but it was adopted in Austria also. Germany to the Germans, foreigners out. That's a kind of very classic, exemplary nativist statement. When it comes to authoritarianism, and authoritarianism has a long history in social science scholarship. You can read a lot of different things into it. But the way it's used in contemporary debates about the radical right and in the definition of Casmud in particular is that it refers to a preference to a desire for strictly ordered society with strict hierarchies, and there shouldn't be any interference in the state's authority. Otherwise, this person should be punished. So in other words, where societal problems are attributed to a lack of discipline and a lack of hierarchy. So say we have a crime problem, we have a drug problem, we have problems in schools, and this is then attributed to his lack of discipline, that the state should be interfere more severely and thereby restore law and order, basically.
Mm-hmm. So how then does the radical right compare with the center right? I mean, where's the distinction between them and the right or the center right, or let's say conventionally what we'd assume to be conservative parties?
So conservative parties, as much as social democratic or center-left parties, I mean, they do have claims on culture and values, but they very much originated in the labor capital divide. So their home turf is the economy. I mean, which is, particularly the case in the UK, where, the Tories represent business historically, and the Labour Party, as the name says, is the Labour Party for working class interests. And of course, you had on the continent cleavages on top of that, say the role of the church, the role of center-periphery divides in Scandinavia in particular. But on the whole, the labor capital divide was foundational to the emergence of these parties as mass parties. And therefore, their home turf is more on distributive issues related to the economy and such. Whereas the radical right, what they, and green parties for that matter, what they politicized was kind of non-economic issues, at least what we call non-economic issues, such as the environment, abortion rights, immigration, the role of women in society. And of course, social democrats and Christian democrats and conservatives, they have positions on those, but they are less united. Their positions are less straightforward. I mean, if you think of conservatives, within conservative parties, you typically have a business right that is more progressive on values, but you also have a more religiously laden right that is more conservative on values. So they are arguably more divided on these questions internally, whereas the radical right, they're united exactly on those issues when it comes to culture, immigration, etc. So I think that's a difference, but more recently, what we could observe is that the boundaries are no longer that clear cut. I mean, we are speaking of ideal types, and as social scientists, we know that there's a difference between real types and ideal types. In the sense that conservative parties, one example could be the Austrian case or the Dutch case, they tried in many ways to co-opt the radical right as a way of taking the wind out of the radical right. The idea being, if we kind of cover those topics, maybe voters find it no longer necessary to vote for the radical right. What political science scholarship suggests is that this is a strategy that typically backfires, in the sense that what it does is that it legitimizes the radical right and mainstreams the radical right further, and actually strengthens the salience on their favorite topics. And in this context, it's no longer that clear cut to make such strong distinction between center right and radical right, because they are kind of I mean, they communicate to each other, and in many ways, center-right parties found it expedient to adopt some of these policies. You see this at the European level with the European People's Party, which has adopted more stricter position, immigration policy, for example. You see this in the Austrian case very much. I mean, that was the strategy of the former party chair, Sebastian Kurz. That was his original contribution to the party of politicizing immigration, etc. So, yeah.
So, in your book, just to move on, you mentioned the term, which I think is genius, culture war capitalism, right? So you heard it today. That's Philip's term that he's going to coin, and I told him earlier that the next book needs to be called Culture War Capitalism. That's the next big project. At least I hope you take my advice on that. But I just think it kind of encapsulates a lot of what's going on. This divide between what do we mean by culture and these culture war issues, and as you said, the kind of the lack of kind of association with these culture war issues and economy. So in your book, you mentioned that. What is it, and why does it matter?
In the book, I start from the assumption prevalent in political science scholarship that there are basically two cleavages. One is culture, one is economy, and they are strictly separated. So the cultural cleavage refers to immigration, identity, abortion, environmentalism. The economic cleavage refers to the size of the state, levels of taxation, levels of redistribution. Mm-hmm. So that's where I'm coming from. So I'm a political scientist by training, although I look mostly on comparative political economy and social policy, but the book speaks to that literature very much. And what I've realized in researching the radical right, I think I've realized, and the radical right, I think shows that, is that these two cleavages are strongly interdependent and interlinked, in the sense that the culture war, it doesn't crowd out distributive conflict because it itself has a strong distributive component. And with respect to the radical right, I mean, I think what these parties have realized is that they need economic policies in order to implement their cultural principles. And you see this with different political projects. I mean, Black Lives Matter, for example, says we need to abolish capitalism. We need to overcome capitalism because it's a racist system. Mm-hmm. So that is an economic argument made on cultural grounds. The radical right says we need to reform. We need to cut back the welfare state in many ways because it benefits people that don't belong to us culturally. And this extends to the role of the family. So in other words, what I'm observing in the book is that the culture war is crucial in order to understand economic policy and the economic politics underpinning contemporary distributive policy making. So in other words, there's a blurring, there's an interlinkages between culture and the economy. And I mean, you also see this just because I've stumbled upon it recently with ESG, so environmental and social
government. Yeah. Sorry.
Yes. Yeah. Where, for example, Ron DeSantis went against this because it's considered woke ideology. Mm-hmm. So investing using pension funds to invest sustainably in the interest of corporate social responsibility and so on. So even these kinds of kind of dry, technical, economic policy investment decisions can be laden in kind of culture war terms. Mm-hmm. And this is what the term culture war capitalism refers to. And I evidence this with respect to the radical right in particular in a number of policy domains.
And so can you give us some examples? I mean, you mentioned Black Lives Matter as, the economic demand is effectively underwriting the entire project. You could add environment now as well. So many on the kind of degrowthers. it's capitalism again needs to be completely abolished in a new system, otherwise the planet is going to be destroyed. Perhaps we can move then to discussing some of the case studies in your book that can breathe light into this, or kind of give us a narrative around what you mean by culture war capitalism. So what are the cases? What is the book about? How does that kind of operationalize culture war capitalism as a concept?
So let's start with the authoritarian ideology of radical right parties. That is, a kind of a preference to restore traditional gender norms, kind of a desire to re-traditionalize gender relations and go against sexual minorities, basically. And you see how this preference, this culturally laden preference, it migrates into family policy in particular, in the sense that family policy is an economic institution that is very effective in order to implement those principles. So in family policy, what the radical right wants to do, and especially in Central and Eastern Europe, where you have on average, in the aggregate, which I show with survey data in the book, conservative attitudes with respect to gender roles and family policy preferences. So what you do from that standpoint then is to basically leave parental leave to mothers more exclusively, not incentivize fathers to take up parental leave in order to entrench those gender roles. You reject or don't expand public childcare arrangements, and thereby also entrench kind of gender roles when it comes to the labor market, about who takes over care responsibilities. And you provide tax cuts to families or child benefits to families, which essentially go into the pockets of the male breadwinner. So these are kinds of policies, family policies, economic policies that help to re-traditionalize or at least stabilize contemporary gender roles on the labor market. And you see this in Central and Eastern Europe to a large extent, but also partly in continental Europe, because you have strong male breadwinner legacies there.
Particularly in Germany, it's still very, female participation in the labor market is still quite low in comparison to other Northwestern European markets. But I'm curious though, just to play devil's advocate, the radical right parties would say, well, we're doing this not necessarily as a xenophobic policy, but because we're facing a demographic crisis. Populations are decreasing. And so we need to, how do we incentivize families or more children to be had? Mm-hmm. And this is a problem across developed economies, right? Is that we see, economies not having replacement rates, and immigration is the only way. How would you respond to that, right? And so I'm not trying to justify radical right policy, but there is a demographic dilemma that policymakers, notwithstanding their political and ideological preferences, need to deal with. How do you see that as a response?
Family policy has always had the ambition to stabilize or increase fertility rates. Mm-hmm. I think that's more or less part of the game historically, and that's why it's been invented historically. So that's arguably not the new issue. I think what is, perhaps also not new is how the radical right politicizes it and turns it into a population management project that plays out along nativist xenophobic lines. Of course, there is a debate to be had about the demographic crisis we have. And the radical right's political approach to this is to reject immigration, to rely on conservative gender roles, at least in the kind of more conservative countries such as Central and Eastern Europe, and turn this into a broader project on which they can mobilize, which, Viktor Orban, for example, said we need more babies, less immigrants. So it turns into a broader nativist, xenophobic framework. And if we think about the demographic crisis, I mean, you have several policy options on the table, one is immigration. The other is childcare. I mean, we know that those countries where you have, relatively speaking, higher fertility rates are also the ones that are more successful in reconciling work and family life, which is typically the Nordic countries, relative to, say, you mentioned Germany, for example, or Italy, which has the lowest fertility rates today in the EU, I believe. So it is an issue, demographic aging, no question. Whether a conservative family policy expansion is a promising strategy to counter that is a highly questionable, I would say.
Because I've heard before, I can't remember where I've multiple times, sort of one of the, the pro-family policies and the kind of the tie-in with the xenophobia is that they say, well, we have a pro-family policy, but we're also anti-immigrant because, or no, let me rephrase this, that the concern is that the immigrants that are coming in come from conservative patriarchal societies, that they're coming in having big families. So why shouldn't we also have effectively conservative and patriarchal values? Why, so it's that sense of we're not doing anything different than the immigrant populations that are coming in. We're reinforcing a conservative patriarchal kind of value structure, and that's no different than the immigrant pool that much of Europe is drawing on.
Traditionally, there were two policy approaches. One is the kind of Scandinavian way, which is to relying on social investment via work-family reconciliation policies and the like. And the more old school 20th century male breadwinner approach was to incentivize stay-at-home mothers and thereby reconcile work-family life, if you will. But what, for example, Viktor Orban did was basically to incentivize women to do both, to be working in paid employment as well as to have more children. And there is research by Eva Fodor, a Hungarian sociologist, who speaks of an emerging care-fare regime, which basically refers to a policy which makes access to social rights dependent on the number of kids you have and marriage. And this on a labor market that is slated against working class representation, that is slated against trade unions and gender equality legislation, inevitably leads to greater exploitation of working women. To be fair, I mean, Hungary has had growing fertility rates, which is arguably down to the family policy Orban has unleashed. Where that's going to continue, I don't know, but it certainly comes at the cost of gender equality when it comes to employment, welfare, and also within households.
Okay, so let's move to your book. Give us the main kind of thesis of the book and then go through some of the case studies and why they're relevant. You mentioned Hungary, but you have other case studies in the book.
Yeah, so I look at how radical right parties influenced economic and social policies when they were in power. So it's about direct policy impact. So what do they do when they are in power? And the motivation behind this was that there is all this talk about radical right parties representing the losers of globalization. And I was curious to what extent this is true when it comes to actual policy making. I mean, who are the winners and losers of their policies? So I looked at radical right parties in Northern Europe, in Central and Eastern Europe, in continental Europe, and the United States. And the argument basically I make is, even though these parties have relatively similar ideological outlooks, they are against immigration, they are in favor of authoritarianism, in favor of law and order, they legislate very different policies. And the argument is that the reason is first because they are affected by globalization so differently. So let us recall the definition I just brought up is around nativism and nationalism. And this is very much a response to globalization. So in the United States, the contestation of globalization is around trade. So it's the cross-border movement of goods that is the contested element of globalization from nationalist standpoint, because the United States has had chronic current trade deficits for perhaps 30, 40 years. And here the discrimination, the nativist discrimination, is against foreign goods in the form of trade protectionism, pulling out of free trade deals, imposing tariffs, the highest tariffs on foreign goods since the 1930s, basically. In continental and Northern Europe, you have export surpluses. So you don't go against foreign trade, you don't go against foreign goods. But what you do have is very generous welfare states and high levels of immigration. So here the nativist nationalist impulse is not against foreign goods, but against foreign welfare claimants. Mm-hmm. So their most original policy impact is a policy typically coined welfare chauvinism, mm-hmm. which refers to selective cutbacks targeted at non-citizens. Started very early in Northern Europe because you have these very universal and generous welfare states, where as a foreign newcomer you have access to relatively generous social assistance and healthcare, etc.
From day one, effectively,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. In Central and Eastern Europe, on the other hand, and here I was very much influenced by a book called Making Capitalism Without Capitalists by Eyal et al. In the early 2000s, where they argued, and I think showed very convincingly, that the central task for post-communist reformers was to attract Western capital after the fallout of the transition period. And you did this by adopting the Washington Consensus. That is a set of liberal economic policies geared to attract Western capital. And the implication of that was a high level of dependence on foreign capital. So whereas in the US, you go against foreign goods, in Western Europe, you go against foreign welfare claimants, what Orban and Kaczynski did in Hungary and Poland was to go against foreign capital. Mm-hmm. By imposing discriminatory taxes on multinational corporations and renationalizing key sectors of the economy, and thereby, build up a domestic capital class, a domestic bourgeoisie, as Viktor Orban calls it, and thereby...
Who are close friends of his as well.
Yes. So you see how these parties contest different elements of globalization depending on how globalization affected their economies and their welfare states. So that's one major part of the book. The second part of the book is that the radical right goes against, through its authoritarian conservative ideology, against liberal value change. Mm-hmm. And the welfare state, it can be effective in restoring traditional values. For example, as I said, in the family, where in Central and Eastern Europe, they expand the conservative pro-natalist family policy because they can build on an electorate that is more favorable towards those attitudes. I mean, Klaus Offe, famous sociologist, once said that this is a kind of outcome of authoritarian egalitarianism, right? So you have a conservative backlash to that socialist and liberal legacy. So socialist in the communist era, liberal legacy in the 1990s and 2000 with the EU accession process. And another aspect of that kind of retraditionalization is to gear the welfare state towards those who are considered hardworking. We call them often labor market insiders in social policy because they have uninterrupted, continuous employment biographies. So they are hardworking and their typical claims around manual work. Whereas those who are have more discontinuous employabilities, who are out of job every now and then, they are suspicious of not doing their bit to the country. So, I mean, most recently, Giorgia Meloni went against social assistance, cut back on kind of minimum income arrangements. And this you see across different countries, that kind of distinction between the hardworking and the potentially lazy, which is often, racialized, and the kind of subtext for, the lazy is typically immigrants. And therefore the welfare state in the eyes of those should be targeted, directed towards the core workforce, the kind of male native core workforce, and therefore social policy should be directed at that. And this you can do in Western Europe in particular, because you have institutional legacies and fiscal space for that kind of policy.
So I'm curious, let's take Scandinavia, take Sweden, for example. Crime has gone up significantly, and there's a fairly significant political shift to the right. On the one hand, the right will say it's partly because we let too many immigrants in and they don't share our values. Those on the left would say, well, actually, it's because of misguided social policies, or in effect cuts to the generous welfare state that used to be the case, that led to the ghettoization and the insufficient integration of newcomers. How would you respond to that debate? And how does it fit with your argument?
I'm not a migration policy scholar per se, so it's not my area of expertise. I mean, you see how it plays out politically along those two lines, between what the left says it's a matter of integration, and the right says it's a matter of these people being alien to our society. What you can see in the Swedish case and Northern Europe more generally is that immigration is kind of economized. Whereas in the United States, you don't have access to generous entitlements as a foreign newcomer. You do have that in Scandinavia. So that's why immigration is or let's say it helps to culturalize the welfare state, or it helps to economize immigration. And therefore, it's perhaps not surprising that this type of welfare state is prone to a welfare chauvinist contestation that goes beyond the kind of typical culture war issue, but has a distributive component on top of it.
So let's move on to the European Parliament elections, which are happening between June 6th and June 8th. Some listeners probably turning off right now because they're not sure what the European Parliament is and what it actually does. So perhaps it's worth saying a bit about European politics generally. I know we're recording this here in the UK, which is no longer part of Europe, but we're still on the doorstep of Europe, and the European Parliament still has some legislative function in the European case. So what they decide has effect here in the UK, but also globally because of the size and scope of the European economy. So let's just say, tell me a bit more. Let's discuss a bit what the European Parliament elections mean, partly because the same culture war capitalism is playing out in that election effectively. And you see the rise of radical right parties in European politics. And if polls are to be believed, they're going to make significant inroads into European politics.
The European election is perhaps itself a misnomer, in the sense that the politics around it is still very much nationally rooted. It's national campaigns, and at the EU level, because these parties then form European parliamentary groups, but the politics around it is still very much fought out at the nation state level. And the reason why I guess the European Parliament election is more salient this time around is exactly for the reason you just highlighted, in the sense that recent reports suggest that the far right will be the big winner of this election. And if we speak about the far right, it's a bit of a complicated situation, because there are, in fact, two parliamentary groups we refer to when we speak about far right. So one is the European conservatives and reformists. Incidentally, a parliamentary group founded by the Tory party. Mm-hmm. So you see where it comes from originally, but it's been, now you have parties such as the Polish PiS, mm-hmm. the Spanish Vox, the Sweden Democrats in that parliamentary group. So you see a radical right imprint in that parliamentary group. That's the first one. The second one is Identity and Democracy, which involves parties such as the Lega in Italy, the Freedom Party in Austria, Le Pen, Rassemblement National from France, so the kind of classic radical right parties. So these are the two contenders we refer to when we speak about the far right at the EU level. And they can basically agree upon two things in particular. One is being against immigration, like the securitization of immigration, turning immigration into a security issue. The externalization of asylum policy, in the sense that, asylum application should be made outside the European Union. And finally, providing vetoes to ambitious climate laws and environmental policy. So this is where they are arguably it can be a significant force. However, their challenges are first on foreign policy, in the sense that the ECR, the European Conservatives and Reformists, they are in favor of NATO and they've been pro-Atlanticist throughout. Whereas Identity and Democracy, some of their key parties have had friendly relations with Putin. Mm-hmm. So they have a hard time to cooperate and collaborate on foreign policy in light of the war in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So that's arguably one challenge they are going to face. And the second one is on the economy, in the sense that, again, I've been alluding to differences in how globalization affected different domestic economies. And you can tell a similar story about how European integration and the Eurozone in particular affected domestic economies differently, and thereby stimulate different positions of radical right parties on the economy. For example, in Germany, the AfD, which is going to be perhaps the strongest party within the ID, the Identity and Democracy. So they've filed an appeal against Next Generation EU, the kind of reconstruction plan, investment plan in the wake of COVID-19. Because they said, our German tax money for our German people. Mm-hmm. The Lega, by contrast, second significant force within the Identity Democracy, said, look, our constraint on policymaking autonomy is that is fiscal rules, and we don't have fiscal space within the framework of the European economic governance and the European Union. So they want, they welcome grants, they welcome greater fiscal space afforded by the European Union and underwritten by the German state. So there you see a kind of north-south divide, in the sense that the north says, we don't want to pay for the south, basically. Mm-hmm. And the south says, give us more breathing space, and we are in an interdependent situation. So we need, after the Euro crisis, Euro bonds. We need, after pandemic, Corona bonds. And to be sure, these differences are also visible among the mainstream parliamentary groups, in the sense that the German conservatives are arguably more in favor of say austerity, which contrasts with, say, the Greek conservatives. However, these parties are more likely to compromise as a way of sustaining their membership in the Eurozone. I mean, that's the kind of raison d'etre of a lot of German economic policy debates, in the sense that we have to sustain our Eurozone membership, and therefore we are willing to provide concessions. And we saw similar moves in southern European countries, with Italy or Greece, where push comes to shove, these parties said, okay, we give in on austerity in order to get cheap access to cheap money and basically stay in the Eurozone. And the difference is with radical right parties is that they threaten to leave the Eurozone. So they no longer threaten to leave the EU because of Brexit, because they realize that this is actually a complicated business.
Yeah.
So they want to change the European Union. That's why they become more vocal in their EU agendas. So that's the new thing. They want to change the EU rather than leaving the EU. But when it comes to the Eurozone, you see this in the manifesto of the AfD, for example, or Lega, at least rhetorically, they campaigned on the promise of basta euro. I'm not sure they would do it, in fact, but they bring that to the table. So from an economic policy perspective, and in light of the issues we've been talking about, is that how, given that they've been affected so differently by European economic and monetary integration, they have different policy proposals, and therefore they will have a hard time to come to an agreement when it comes to economic policy. And we saw this in Milan in 2019, where Identity and Democracy, they formed their parliamentary group, and they could agree on reducing the spread of Islam and immigration, etc. But they could not agree on fiscal policy. And you see this in their most recent declaration, which is a 2-pager without any reference to economic or fiscal policy. So my inclination would be that their unity is more around immigration and the environment. And then the question is to what extent the center-right, the EPP, will collaborate with them, because they need them.
The European People's Party.
Yes, the center-right European People's Party. That would be the crucial question in the term ahead.
So to play devil's advocate, though, you can say, at least at the European level, that there's an increase in radical right parties within the European Parliament, which will affect European politics. But is it not, the European Union has always been criticized for being overly technocratic, undemocratic. It's led by Brussels elite, it's led by the Commission. And, even though these parties come with ideas, I mean, isn't it, who cares if they come with ideas to push, even if they're diametrically opposed with each other in that policy, but the fact that they bring them to the table, is that not healthy for European democracy?
I think it's you're right, in the sense that the populist contestation, if you will, of the European Union is linked to its democratic deficit. So if you don't allow for an opposition within the political system, it's the political system itself that is being called into question. And this has to do with how the political system of the EU, its sui generis character, is organized, in the sense that the European Commission has the legislative monopoly when it comes to initiatives, and then it's a complex interplay between member states, the Council, and the European Parliament, and it's difficult to read through. But the general perception of voters is that this is something that is hard to change. It's intractable. And I think, being here in the UK, Brexit was a manifestation of that. And in terms of policy diversity, I think Brexit was kind of a blessing in disguise, in the sense that it's no longer EU membership that is so much at stake, but the kind of trajectory the EU is supposed to head to, in the sense that the EU is kind of a liberal hallmark, at least in terms of its self-declaration, and in terms of economic policies. It's debatable to what extent this translates to refugees, etc. But the new outlook of these parties is to change it from within, basically.
Right. But just to again, take environmental policy, or climate policy. If you think of the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, their stronghold is in Eastern Germany, and I've read some of the pushback against push towards net zero is that they'd say, well, okay, a house in some of our regions, you can buy a home for 30,000 euros. Maybe that's on the low side. The cost of upgrading this house and putting a heat pump in and making it energy efficient is 30,000 euros, right? So some of the costs, which if you live in a big German city and your house is worth $1 million, and the 30,000 of $1 million is not very big, but in some of these regions, the costs of the energy transition are such that they look very significant compared with the resources that these people have. And so some of the pushback might not be necessarily anti-environment or anti-climate change, though I think there is obviously some of that in there, some of that kind of climate denialism. But there's also some of that anxiety of how am I supposed to pay for this, and how feasible is it? It's easy for kind of elites in big cities to think about a transition, but for us, resource-wise, it's difficult.
Yes. It's arguably a manifestation of cultural capitalism, in the sense that environmentalism was long considered a post-material issue, and we see it obviously isn't. It certainly isn't. And I think with respect to the climate and environmental policy and the European Green Deal, it is absolutely crucial to recognize the distributive impact of that. And because the main reason is, who is going to, or could stand to lose from that in economic terms? So who could be the economic loser of that? It's the lower middle class, because they live in the countryside. They are often homeowners, so they have to retrofit them with the costs you just said. They are disproportionately reliant on cars, so therefore they have to change on that in terms of their financial costs, but also in terms of their lifestyle, if you will. And finally, they are overrepresented in kind of fossil fuel sectors in terms of their employment. So it's exactly the group of voters that was hit hardest by deindustrialization and globalization. And I think one important reason why we see the kind of politics we have is because this group of voters deserted to ratified parties because of status anxieties, and their status was being called into question by the massive structural changes we've been observing in the wake of globalization and deindustrialization. So to me, the political implication of that is to think about status guarantees, is to think about status protection, because if we don't have that, the radical right will politicize environmentalism on nostalgic grounds, which is to say, in the good old days, no one told us how to drive and how to heat and how to live. So therefore, we keep things as they are in order for you to make ends meet and to keep things as they are. but things can't keep stay as they are. And so for the politics of consensus mobilization on environmental policy, I think we shouldn't do the same mistake which we did perhaps with globalization of allowing structural economic change to create clear winners and losers, and make sure that we have an inclusive platform that gets across that no one's supposed to lose from that in the short term in economic ways.
All right, so first it was globalization, or no, first deindustrialization, then globalization, and now it's the energy transition. That's the next big kind of rallying cry, and already is, of the radical right. But effectively what you're saying, it's incumbent upon the conventional mainstream parties to get their act together and understand the anxiety of the voters effectively. I mean, it's
exactly, yes.
And not to ignore them.
It's the rise of the radical right is a failure of responsiveness.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you see this in the 1990s when the center left was heavily focused on fiscal consolidation, on fiscal austerity, and you saw campaigns saying basically austerity, yes, but in a social manner, and thereby depoliticize the economy and present a kind of fait accompli, in the sense, okay, this is the new normal and we have to live with it. I mean, the most pronounced manifestation of that is in Central and Eastern Europe, where the ex-communist left tried to disassociate itself from its communist past by turning into the most liberal parties in an economic sense,
mm-hmm.
and thereby creating opportunities for the radical right to assume a protectionist role and thereby attract lower income voters, especially lower income, lower middle class voters and working class voters. And in a sense, you see this in France as well, in the sense that where Macron is, as I think Bruno Amable calls him, the last neoliberal,
mm-hmm.
and which again creates opportunities for Le Pen to assume a more protectionist role. And that protectionism is selective and particularistic, geared towards that group of voters.
Mm-hmm.
Male core workforce, native, dominant social groups of the 20th century, but they live outside the booming metropolitan urban areas, mm-hmm. with outside the knowledge economies, with lower levels of education, and they are tied to declining economic sectors and regions that are become less appealing in terms of their infrastructure, mm-hmm. etc. And that's why I think that's an important implication of the environmental policy debate we have to focus on that group of voters in particular, and we have policy instruments at our mm-hmm. disposal in order to make that work.
Because would you agree that it's I mean, you say it's they're afraid of they're seeing material decline in their well-being, their status is in decline, but what troubles me sometimes on the left is responses that, well, they just need to accept that their status is in decline and that other people are kind of on the up and that times are changing. Is it possible to kind of maintain their sense of self, their sense of their status, if you like, while allowing for change elsewhere, while allowing for a progressive kind of immigration system and multiculturalism to flourish as well? I mean, is it an either or scenario, or can we have both and?
When it comes to the left, I think Sherry Berman was right. In Sherry Berman, a political scientist in Boston, having written a famous book on the origins and ideological trajectories of social democracy, center-left parties, which she summarized with a phrase of primacy of politics, the primacy of politics over markets, which is the opposite of what you just insinuated, which is to say that, there's structural changes, nothing we can do about it, So, for example, Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, they compared globalization with the weather. They said, like, somebody who wants to change globalization is equal to somebody who wants to change the weather. It's impossible. And, guess what? A few 2 decades down the line, there is a talk about TTIP, and somebody like Donald Trump comes along and says,
look, TTIP is a trade deal.
Yes, a trade deal, and says, look, free trade is finished. And I don't care about the orthodoxy. I mean, I care about, quote unquote, our people. So if you let go of that sense of primacy of politics, you may well end up with a right-wing conceptualization of the primacy of politics, which is more xenophobic, which is more authoritarian, and which puts our democracy at stake. And arguably, I mean, to me, it's a strong terminology. Maybe that's down to my me coming from Austria in a Catholic country, but the original sin, if you want, of neoliberalism is not so much inequality. I mean, if you run on a platform and you want to implement that platform as much as possible, and if part of that platform is right-wing economic policies, you go for it, and the outcome is inequality, and that's within the confines of democracy, So then it's up to the opposition to change things. But I mean, the fallout of neoliberalism is today that we have the rise of authoritarian strongmen who say, okay, we repoliticize things, we repoliticize the economy, we repoliticize democracy, we provide an alternative, and that alternative is what Orban calls illiberal democracy, which is conducive to democratic backsliding, and so the trajectory towards an electoral autocracy, if you will, where you still have elections, but the political system is tilted in favor of the incumbent. So therefore, you no longer have an open debate. You no longer have an open playing field where there's a fair party competition context.
Is it not just the case that the radical right is doing well because they have an ideology and they stick to it?
Yes.
They have ideas.
Yes.
And they say, we're going to do something different, and it's focused on you, the voter. Whereas so many of the conventional parties, this is the problem. People are like, well, I don't know what they believe.
Absolutely, yes.
I don't know what they believe. I don't know what they're for, And I think that's why people want sort of leadership, and they want ideas, and they want, I'm sure people say, no, from the center parties or the conventional parties, no, we have ideas, but they're not reaching people.
Yes.
They're not connecting with people.
I agree in the sense that there is a kind of a journalistic narrative that basically says populism is about being indifferent and flexible and changing all the time. But I think in order to change the terms of the debate as much as the radical right did, you need ideology. So, yeah, I think that their conception of politics is not only short-term electoral. It's not only about winning the next election. These parties have had a long-term hegemonic ambition, changing the terms of the debate, imposing their common sense on others. And that's why we are in the current moment where it's harder to pin down mainstream parties because they've changed over time, and they but also, to be fair, they are confronted with the challenge of governing, which is difficult.
Difficult. And that's what you see the radical right when they get power, they change their tune, or they don't implement these radical policies because they can't, and it's they have to
Not all of them, but just thinking about the Netherlands, where there's still no government, but Geert Wilders, did really well in the elections, and he's changed a lot of his tune a bit, right? It's less strident as it was before. I mean, he sticks to a lot of it, but it's still it's tempered, if you like, because he's going to have to be part of a governing system. He's going to have to join in and govern. Well, on that note, perhaps a positive one, that maybe not so positive, but I guess the positive note is that, well, politicians need to bring ideas, and the conventional parties, if they want to challenge the radical right, they need to have a sense of ideology.
Yeah, I think we can conclude on that note.
We can conclude on that note. Much to think about. Well, Philip Rathgeb, thanks for being on the New Enlightenment podcast, and hope to have you on again in the future.
Thanks for having me. Been a pleasure.
You have been listening to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. If you found this interesting, please consider subscribing and sharing. If you would like to learn more about Panmure House, please go to our website, panmurehouse.org. Thanks for listening, and until next time.